The Duke chose the shy spinster sister as a bet so he could win 50 guineas, but then she turned his entire world upside down and walked away with his heart before he even realized it was gone. The ballroom at Ashcroft House was the kind of room that made people feel smaller than they were. 3 chandeliers blazed overhead, their candlelight throwing gold across the ceiling and catching the jewels at every woman's throat. The air smelled of hothouse roses, warm wax, and the particular perfume of 200 people performing happiness for one another. Silk gowns swept the marble floor. Fans clicked open and shut like the wings of restless birds. Somewhere near the far windows, a string quartet played a quadrille that no one was truly listening to, and in the very center of it all stood Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Renmore, looking precisely as a duke should look at his own summer ball. Which is to say, thoroughly bored by everyone in it. He was 31 years old, with the kind of face that portrait painters loved and mothers pointed out to their daughters. Tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, he held his champagne glass the way other men held winning cards, loosely, as though the victory were already decided. He was laughing at something Lord Hadley had just said, though he hadn't fully heard it. "Come now, Ashford," Hadley was saying, nudging him with an elbow that smelled of cognac. "You cannot stand here and tell us there is a single woman in this room whose affections you could not secure if you chose to." "I would never be so vulgar as to say it aloud," Sebastian replied. "It is simply understood." The small circle of gentlemen, Hadley, the younger Viscount Pembridge, and Sir Giles Fenton, erupted in the sort of laughter that echoed poorly off marble floors. "Prove it then," Pembridge said, grinning. He was 25, newly come into his title, and had the particular confidence of a man who had not yet been properly embarrassed by life. "Choose any unmarried lady present. Win her affections within the season. We wager 50 guineas each that you cannot." Sebastian turned his glass slowly in his fingers. He was about to dismiss the whole thing. He was far too senior in rank for schoolboy games, when Fenton pointed across the ballroom. "Her," Fenton said. Sebastian followed the direction of Fenton's gaze and found a woman standing beside a large arrangement of white dahlias near the far wall. She wore a gown of pale grey-green silk, modest at the neckline, without a single piece of significant jewelry save for a small pearl brooch at her collar. Her dark hair was arranged simply, neatly, with none of the elaborate curls the other women were sporting that season. She held a cup of ratafia and appeared to be watching the dancing with the quiet patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be asked. "Miss Whitmore," Hadley supplied helpfully. "Eleanor Whitmore, the elder one. The family has the Whitmore estate in Surrey. Respectable enough, but she's been out for years. 7, I think. Perhaps 8. Nobody's made an offer." "She's practically a fixture," Pembridge said. "I'd wager she knows every wall in every ballroom in London by now." "Gentlemen," Sebastian said, glancing at her once more before turning back to them. "That is hardly a challenge." "Then it should be easy," Fenton said, pleasantly. Sebastian looked at her again. She was not what the season celebrated. She was not fashionably pale or fashionably animated. She was simply still, in the way that a person is still when they have nowhere particular to be, and have made their peace with it. As he watched, an elderly gentleman in a rather ancient coat shuffled up beside her, and Miss Whitmore turned to him with a smile so sudden and so warm that it briefly changed her entire face. Sebastian set his glass on a passing footman's tray. "Very well," he said. "Done." He crossed the ballroom with the easy movement of a man who knew every eye in the room would track him. He was not wrong. Conversation dimmed as he passed, heads turned, and a path cleared without his having to ask for one. He was accustomed to all of it. He came to a stop before Miss Whitmore and the elderly gentleman. Up close, she was perhaps 27 or 28. Her eyes were dark brown, steady, and slightly cautious in the way of someone who had learned to assess a room quietly and trust it slowly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, inclining his head. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced. I am Renmore." She made a neat, unhurried curtsy. "Your Grace." "I wonder," he said, with the particular warmth he had long ago learned to deploy like a well-sharpened instrument. If you would do me the honor of the next dance. There was a pause, a brief one. You are very kind, Your Grace, Miss Whitmore said. But I am afraid I have already promised this dance to Colonel Briggs. She glanced at the elderly gentleman beside her, who gave Sebastian a small, perfectly amiable nod. Sebastian blinked. In a career of considerable social success, he could not immediately recall the last time he had been declined. Of course, he said, recovering smoothly. Then perhaps a later set. We shall see how the evening falls, she said politely, and turned back to the colonel with an expression that did not suggest she was particularly troubled by his departure. Sebastian walked back across the ballroom at the same pace he had arrived, betraying nothing. Behind him, he could already hear Pembridge stifling a laugh into his glove. She refused you, Hadley said, barely keeping his face straight. She did not refuse me, Sebastian said calmly, picking up a fresh glass of champagne. She had a prior engagement. With a 70-year-old colonel. Age is not relevant. The wager stands then? Fenton asked. Sebastian looked across the ballroom one more time. Miss Whitmore had returned to her quiet observation of the dancing, apparently undisturbed. The colonel was saying something that made her smile again. A real one, not the careful, mannered variety deployed by most women in rooms like these. The wager stands, Sebastian said. He told himself it was because he disliked losing. He was not yet prepared to consider that it might be something else entirely. 3 days after the ball, Sebastian Ashford did something he had not done in at least a decade. He asked questions about a woman before pursuing her. Not through any particular humility, he simply wanted to understand what he was dealing with. He made discreet inquiries among mutual acquaintances, and what came back surprised him more than the refusal had. Miss Eleanor Whitmore was not, as society casually assumed, a quiet spinster waiting patiently for a proposal that had never arrived. She ran the Whitmore estate in Surrey almost entirely on her own. Her father had died 4 years ago, leaving behind a younger sister, a pleasant but financially careless mother, and a property that had required serious attention. Eleanor had given it that attention. Quietly, without advertisement, and apparently without complaint. Nobody in London seemed to think this was particularly interesting. Sebastian found, somewhat against his will, that he did. He rode to Surrey on a Thursday morning under an agreeably respectable excuse, a letter from Lord Pemberton regarding a shared acquaintance which required personal delivery in the loosest possible interpretation of the phrase. The countryside was deep green and unhurried, the hedgerows thick with late summer growth. He arrived at Whitmore Hall just before noon. It was a handsome house, though not a grand one. Red brick, ivy along the east wing, gardens that were well kept rather than fashionable. The kind of house that had been lived in seriously for several generations. He expected to be shown into a drawing room and offered tea while a housemaid went to fetch Miss Whitmore from whatever gentle occupation filled her mornings. Instead, the housemaid who answered the door looked briefly uncertain and said,
Miss Whitmore is in the east yard, sir, with Mr. Hatch and the tenants. Shall I fetch her?
No need, Sebastian said pleasantly. I shall find her. He followed the sound of voices around the side of the house and stopped at the edge of a yard where 4 people stood around an open ledger balanced on a fence post. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the center of them in a plain brown wool dress with her sleeves pushed back and her hair pinned up with considerably less ceremony than it had been at the ball. She was speaking to an older man, Mr. Hatch, presumably the estate steward, and pointing at something in the ledger with the assured manner of someone who had read those pages many times before. The Granger family cannot wait until November, she was saying. The roof needs attention before the autumn rains, and the cost is manageable if we draw from the harvest account now rather than later. Delay it, and we pay twice. Hatch scratched his jaw. Your mother may not agree to the expenditure, Miss Whitmore. My mother does not manage the harvest account, Eleanor said, not unkindly. I do. See to it. She closed the ledger, handed it back, and turned to the 2 tenant farmers beside her, with a shorter, quieter conversation about drainage on the lower field. Sebastian stood at the edge of the yard and waited. She had not seen him yet, and he did not announce himself. He was, he realized, watching her the way one watches something unexpected. with the particular attention that arrives when the world declines to behave as assumed. When the tenants finally departed, touching their hats, she turned and saw him. There was a pause, short but honest. Something crossed her face that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure, and then her expression settled into the same courteous composure she had worn at the ball. "Your Grace," she said, smoothing her skirt without apparent embarrassment. "I was not expecting a caller." "I had correspondence for your family from Lord Pemberton," he said, producing the letter. "I was riding this direction and thought to deliver it personally rather than trust it to the post." She took it, glanced at the seal, and looked back at him with eyes that were, he noticed, not entirely convinced. "That was kind of you," she said. "Please come inside. Mrs. Whitmore will want to offer you refreshment." Tea was served in the drawing room by a mother who flushed with pleasure at having a duke in her parlour, and a younger sister, Miss Charlotte Whitmore, 17 and entirely without subtlety, who stared at Sebastian with unguarded fascination for the full duration of the visit. Eleanor poured the tea herself, asked him 2 polite questions about his journey, and otherwise allowed her mother to carry the conversation, which Mrs. Whitmore did with considerable enthusiasm. On his way out, Sebastian paused on the front steps and turned to Eleanor, who had come to see him off with the obligatory courtesy of the household. "There is a garden party at Fairfield House next Saturday," he said. "Lady Cavendish hosts it annually. I wonder if you might attend." "I had not planned to," she said. "It would be worth your while. The gardens are exceptional." "I have quite satisfactory gardens of my own, Your Grace," she said, with the faint suggestion of something that might, in a less composed woman, have been amusement. "Thank you for the letter." She stepped back inside. The door closed with a quiet, unhurried click that Sebastian felt unreasonably clearly on the ride home. He told himself, again, that this was simply the nature of a challenge. He was not unnerved. He was not intrigued in any way that mattered. He told himself this with considerably less certainty than he had 3 days ago. Bath in September wore its beauty without trying. The honey-colored stone of its terraces caught the morning light and held it warmly, and the streets smelled of mineral water, fresh bread from the bakeries on Milsom Street, and the particular clean crispness that came with the turning of the season. Visitors filled the pump rooms and promenades, the assembly halls buzzed with music most evenings, and the whole city carried the pleasant atmosphere of people who had decided collectively to enjoy themselves before winter made enjoyment harder. Eleanor had not come for enjoyment. She had come for her cousin Margaret's engagement celebrations, which were being held across 4 days at the home of her aunt, Mrs. Haverstock, in the Royal Crescent. Margaret was sweet-natured and genuinely happy, and Eleanor was glad for her. She had also, within 6 hours of arriving, been handed 3 separate social obligations, 1 committee meeting regarding a local lending library her aunt supported, and a list of calls to make on Margaret's behalf before the official celebration dinner on Friday. She did not mind. Occupation suited her far better than idleness. What she did not anticipate, stepping into the pump room on Tuesday morning with her aunt on one arm and a mild headache from the previous evening's celebrations on the other, was finding Sebastian Ashford standing 20 feet away, reading the notice board with the relaxed posture of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He turned before she could reasonably pretend not to have seen him. "Miss Whitmore." He looked genuinely pleased, which she did not entirely trust. "What a coincidence." "Is it?" she said. It was not a question. He received it as such anyway, and smiled. "I have business with an estate solicitor here," he said. "Matters relating to a property in the county. I arrived yesterday." His tone was easy and perfectly believable, and Eleanor had no evidence to contradict it. She also had no particular reason to believe it. She introduced him to her aunt, who reacted to the title with the same barely concealed delight as her own mother had, and then endured a quarter of an hour in the pump room, during which Sebastian spoke to Mrs. Haverstock about Bath's architecture with what appeared to be genuine knowledge, drank his glass of mineral water without complaint, which Eleanor privately noted, as most people found the taste deeply unpleasant, and made no further attempt to engage her directly. This, she found, was somehow more unsettling than if he had. Their paths crossed twice more that week without apparent arrangement. Once at a concert in the upper rooms, where he was seated 3 rows behind her party and did not seek her out during the interval, though he nodded pleasantly when their eyes met. Once on the Pulteney Bridge, where they were both apparently heading in the same direction and fell into step together for the length of it with the naturalness of an accident. It was during that walk that something shifted, quietly and without announcement. He asked her about a book she was carrying, a volume on Roman architecture she had borrowed from her aunt's shelf, and instead of the polite, half-attentive response she expected from a man making conversation for form's sake, he argued with her. Pleasantly, but genuinely. He thought the author had undervalued the engineering achievements in favor of aesthetic commentary. She thought the author had done precisely the right thing, since the aesthetic achievement was the point. They disagreed for the full length of the bridge, with the comfortable energy of 2 people who were, for once, not performing anything for anyone. At the far end, she stopped and looked at him. "You have actually read it," she said. "Did you think I hadn't?" "I assumed you were being agreeable." "I am rarely simply agreeable," he said. "Ask anyone who knows me." She considered that. It had the ring of truth, which was inconvenient. Over the following 2 days, she found herself less guarded in his company than was sensible. They talked about travel. She had never been further than Yorkshire. He had spent 3 months in Florence the previous year and described it with an unaffected vividness that made her want to see it herself. They argued about whether Bath's social rituals were charming or exhausting. She said both, depending on the day. He said primarily exhausting, which made her laugh before she thought to stop herself. She noticed he did not flirt. He had the tools for it, the smile, the easy confidence, the sort of attention that could be deployed as flattery, but he didn't use them on her. He simply talked to her, as though she were someone whose opinions were worth the trouble of hearing. This was, she thought, either genuine or a very sophisticated strategy. She could not yet determine which. She was aware that she was being pursued. The Surrey visit had settled that question, but the manner of it continued to confuse her expectations. On Thursday evening, before the engagement dinner, her aunt remarked over supper that the Duke of Renmore appeared quite taken with Eleanor. Eleanor said nothing and passed the bread basket, but later, sitting at her dressing table while her maid pinned her hair, she caught her own expression in the mirror and found something there she hadn't expected. Not hope, precisely. She was too sensible for hope. Something smaller than hope. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She blew out the candle quickly, as though darkness might settle the matter. It didn't. The letter arrived on a wet October morning, and Eleanor read it twice before she put it down. It was from a Reverend Michaels in a small village called Harnwick, 3 miles outside York. The school her father had established there 11 years ago, a modest building, 12 desks, 1 teacher, was in serious trouble. The teacher, a Mr. Aldous, had fallen gravely ill and not recovered. Funds meant to cover the winter term had gone missing, somewhere between a local trustee's account and the school's own ledger. 12 children were currently receiving no education, and their parents, most of them tenant farmers, had no means to arrange otherwise. Eleanor had the carriage prepared by noon. She did not write to anyone about the trip. She did not announce it. She packed 2 trunks, arranged for her mother's comfort in her absence, left detailed instructions with Hatch regarding the estate, and set off north with her maid Martha and the coachman before the afternoon turned grey. What she did not know until she arrived at the Harnwick Inn 2 days later was that word of her journey had reached Sebastian Ashford through a mutual acquaintance in York who had happened to mention, at a dinner Sebastian attended for entirely unrelated reasons, that Miss Whitmore of Surrey was travelling north on some charitable business involving a school. He arrived in Harnwick the morning after she did. Eleanor was standing in the schoolroom when she heard the carriage. She was inspecting the building with Reverend Michaels, who was a small, worried man with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had been carrying a problem alone for too long. The schoolroom was cold, the fireplace choked with damp ash, 3 of the window panes cracked, and the blackboard crumbling at one corner. The desks were still arranged in their rows, as though the children might walk back in at any moment. She heard voices outside, then boots on the stone step. Sebastian ducked through the low doorway and straightened, taking in the room with a single glance. His coat was dusty from the road, and he had clearly ridden part of the way, rather than staying with the carriage, because there was mud on his boots that had not come from any well-maintained street. Eleanor stared at him. "You followed me to Yorkshire," she said. "I had business in York," he said. "You said that in Bath as well." "I am a man of considerable business." Reverend Michaels looked between them with the uncertain expression of a man who had expected a quiet morning. Eleanor turned back to the blackboard. "The roof needs attention on the east side," she told the Reverend, "and the fireplace will need sweeping before any fire is lit. I want to see the accounts this afternoon, all of them, including the trustee correspondence." She did not ask Sebastian to leave. She did not invite him to stay. He simply remained. By midday, he was outside with 2 village men examining the roof. She could hear them talking, not directing, she noticed, just talking, the way men talk when the work itself is the point. By afternoon, he had arranged for a glazier from the nearby town to come the following morning about the windows. She found this difficult to dismiss and chose not to examine it closely. The accounts, when she spread them across the inn's parlor table that evening, told a worse story than the letter had. The missing funds amounted to nearly £40, not a catastrophic sum for someone of means, but entirely beyond the reach of Harnwick's tenant families. The trustee responsible had left the district. There was no realistic prospect of recovery through any formal channel. Sebastian sat across the table from her. He had not been invited to the accounting session either. He was simply there, with a cup of tea, reading the correspondence she pushed across to him when she was done with each page. "I can cover the shortfall," he said after a while. "No," she said immediately. "Why not?" "Because this school was my father's work, and I will not have it dependent on the charity of someone who will lose interest by spring." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a fair concern," he said, "about someone else. It is not accurate about me." "I don't know enough about you to be certain of that." "No," he agreed, "you don't." He did not argue further, which surprised her. He folded the last letter neatly, placed it on the pile, and finished his tea. The next 3 days passed in the particular rhythm of practical work. Eleanor met with parents, assessed what the children had already learned, interviewed a young woman from the village, a Miss Pace, 20 years old, educated above her station by a generous former employer, who agreed to teach for a modest wage until a permanent arrangement could be made. Sebastian quietly handled the glazier, the roof repairs, and sourced firewood from a local merchant at a price that Eleanor suspected was considerably below market rate, though he did not say so. On the last evening, walking back from the school through a lane gone amber with fallen leaves, she said, without planning to, "My father would have liked this place." Sebastian said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell me about him." She did, for the length of the lane and beyond it. She did not notice, until much later that night, that she had answered without hesitation. The market town of Skelton wore celebration like a borrowed coat, cheerfully, slightly impractically, with ribbons tied to everything that would hold still long enough. Harvest festivals in the north of England were not the restrained, polished affairs that London society organized when it wished to appear rustic. They were loud and genuinely felt. Farmers who had spent 3 months in anxious conversation with the sky finally exhaled. Barrels were rolled out from inn cellars. Children ran between adult legs without being corrected. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke drifted across the market square from mid-morning onwards, and by late afternoon, the whole town carried the warm, golden looseness of people who had earned their relief. Eleanor had not intended to still be in Yorkshire when the festival arrived. She had intended to settle the school's immediate affairs and return to Surrey within the week, but the rain had other plans. 3 days of heavy, unrelenting rain swept down from the moors and turned the lower fields to shallow lakes. 2 tenant families on the edge of Harnwick found their grain stores flooded. A third lost a section of fencing that sent their livestock wandering across a neighbouring property, creating a dispute that required careful handling. Eleanor stayed. She wrote to her mother, updated Hatch, and set about the immediate problem of ensuring the affected families had enough to carry them through to the next quarter. Sebastian stayed too. She had stopped questioning this. He rode out to the flooded farms with her on the second morning, the pair of them in Macintoshes that did very little against the particular determination of Yorkshire rain. He spoke to the farmers without condescension, which she noticed. Men of his rank often addressed tenant farmers the way they addressed furniture, around rather than to. Sebastian asked direct questions and listened to the answers with his full attention, and the farmers, after an initial wariness around the title, responded to him accordingly. By the third day, the rain had cleared. The fields steamed gently in weak sunshine. The relief effort was organized. Eleanor had coordinated grain contributions from 3 neighboring landowners. Sebastian had settled the livestock dispute with a calmness that surprised even the parties involved, and the town of Skelton prepared, with considerable determination, to celebrate anyway. Eleanor found herself at the festival without quite having decided to attend it. Martha had pressed her into a gown she had brought, on the vague possibility of the engagement celebrations requiring something presentable, a deep blue wool, simply cut, warmer than it looked. The market square was strung with lanterns that swayed in the evening breeze and threw soft, moving light across the cobblestones. A fiddle band played at one end with infectious energy. Long tables groaned with bread, roasted fowl, apple preserves, and more varieties of pie than Eleanor had ever seen assembled in one place. She found Sebastian at the edge of the square, talking to Reverend Michaels with a cup of something warm in each hand. He passed one to her when she reached them without asking whether she wanted it. She discovered it was spiced cider and that she did want it, very much. The evening passed with the loose, easy quality of time spent without agenda. They ate at the long tables between Reverend Michaels and a farmer named Dodd, who had very strong opinions about the correct method of storing root vegetables, and who explained these opinions at considerable length to Sebastian, who listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. Eleanor caught Sebastian's eye once across the table and looked away quickly because the expression on his face, patient, amused, entirely unperformed, did something inconvenient to her composure. Later, when the fiddle band shifted into something slower and couples moved to the cleared cobblestones at the center of the square, Sebastian set down his cup and offered her his hand. She looked at it for a moment. "It is only a country dance," he said, "not a declaration." She took his hand. It was nothing like the formal, careful dances of London ballrooms. There was no audience assessing technique, no chaperone tracking proximity, no social calculation underneath every movement. The fiddle pulled them into a simple, turning rhythm, and they followed it. And for the duration of that dance, Eleanor forgot, with startling completeness, every sensible reservation she had carefully maintained since Surrey. He was a good dancer. She already knew that from the ball, but here he danced without performance, which was different. He watched her face rather than the space over her shoulder. When she missed a step on the uneven cobblestones, he caught her elbow without comment, and they continued without breaking the rhythm. The music slowed further. The lantern light was golden and close. They had stopped moving in any deliberate way, and were simply standing on the cobblestones, with the music still playing around them, close enough that she could see the slight unevenness of his breathing. He looked at her in a way that asked a question without using words. She understood the question. She stepped back. Not sharply. There was no scene, no dramatic withdrawal. She simply created distance with a small, deliberate movement and looked at the lanterns above them rather than at him. "I should find Martha," she said quietly. He said nothing. He did not reach for her or press the moment. She walked away across the cobblestones and did not look back, because she already knew, with a certainty that frightened her thoroughly, that if she did, she would walk straight back. London in autumn was a different city to the one it had been in summer. The grand balls thinned into smaller, more deliberate gatherings, dinner parties, salon evenings, afternoon calls where the real business of society was conducted in drawing rooms over tea and careful conversation. The light changed too, turning from the long gold of summer evenings into something shorter and sharper, the sky above the terraces a particular shade of pale gray that made the city look as though it were thinking hard about something. Eleanor had returned to London at her mother's insistence. Margaret's engagement required various celebrations that demanded family presence, and Mrs. Whitmore had written 3 letters in quick succession, each one more plaintive than the last, until Eleanor packed her trunk and came.
She had not seen Sebastian since Yorkshire. He had written once, a brief, correct letter inquiring after the school's progress and mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that he had ensured the Glazier's final invoice was settled. She had written back with equal brevity, thanking him and reporting that Miss Pace had begun teaching and the attendance was already at 9 children. It was a correspondence entirely without intimacy. She had made sure of that. In London, however, distance proved harder to maintain. He called on the Whitmore household on a Tuesday with flowers for her mother and a book on Italian waterways for Eleanor, which was such a precisely correct gift, not romantic, not impersonal, exactly the sort of thing she would actually read, that she found it more unsettling than roses would have been. He escorted both women to a concert at the Hanover Square Rooms the following Thursday.
He was present at 2 of the same dinner parties in the space of 10 days, seated near enough each time for conversation, without being near enough to generate comment. Society, however, was generating its own commentary without any assistance. She heard it first from Margaret, who reported it with the breathless excitement of someone delivering genuinely extraordinary news. Then from Mrs. Haverstock, who mentioned it with careful casualness over tea. Then from 3 separate women at a card evening, who brought it up with varying degrees of subtlety. The Duke of Renmore was apparently courting Miss Eleanor Whitmore. The consensus, delivered with the particular mixture of surprise and amusement that society reserved for the genuinely unexpected, was that it was peculiar. Flattering for Eleanor, naturally. Nobody said otherwise to her face. But peculiar. He was a duke. He could have anyone. He was choosing a woman 7 years past her first season, without great beauty, without fortune, without the connections that typically directed men of his rank toward specific drawing rooms. Eleanor listened to all of it and felt, underneath the warmth she was carefully not acknowledging, the persistent, quiet scratch of something wrong. She could not name it precisely. She only knew that every time she reached toward trust, some cooler instinct pulled her back. The evening it broke open was a Wednesday. Sebastian had not been present. It was a gentleman's dinner at Hadley's townhouse, the sort of gathering Eleanor would never have attended or been informed of under ordinary circumstances. She learned what happened there through Charlotte, who had heard it from the young wife of one of the junior guests, who had heard it from her husband that same night when he arrived home later than expected and considerably less sober than he had left. Lord Hadley, deep in his 3rd bottle of port, had apparently found it enormously funny. He had told the full table, 12 men, various ranks, various degrees of discretion, about the wager, about the summer ball, about the 50 guineas from Pembridge and Fenton, about the group of them standing in Sebastian's own ballroom, scanning the room for the least likely candidate, selecting Eleanor Whitmore beside her wall of dahlias because she was, in Hadley's retelling, practically invisible. By Thursday morning, it had moved from 12 dining rooms to 40. Eleanor heard the complete version from Charlotte at breakfast, delivered in a horrified whisper, with both hands pressed flat on the tablecloth, as though the table might otherwise float away. She sat and listened to every word with a stillness that Charlotte found frightening enough to stop twice and ask if she was all right. She said she was perfectly all right. She went upstairs, closed her bedroom door, and stood at the window for a long time looking at the street below without seeing any of it. She thought about Surrey and the letter she had believed was a coincidence. She thought about Bath and the estate business that had brought him there at precisely the right moment. She thought about Yorkshire and the Harvest Festival and the lantern light on the cobblestones, and the way she had stepped back from him and felt it as loss. She thought about the book on Italian waterways sitting open on her desk. Each memory, which had seemed one thing an hour ago, now arranged itself into a different shape entirely. A game, a strategy, a very long, very patient performance staged entirely for an audience of one. She had been chosen because nobody else would have expected it. She had been chosen because she was easy to overlook. She packed her trunk before lunch. She left a short note for her mother, citing family matters requiring her immediate return to Surrey, which was not entirely untrue. She simply could not be in this city for another hour. She did not leave a note for Sebastian. She didn't trust herself to write one without it saying far too much or far too little. The carriage pulled away from the London house in the early afternoon, and Eleanor watched the city disappear behind her with dry eyes and a jaw set so firmly it ached by the time they reached the first toll road. She had cried before over smaller wounds. She refused to cry over this one. Not yet. Not where anyone could see. The Cornish coast in November was not beautiful in any comfortable sense. It was dramatic and indifferent and enormous. The cliffs dropped sheer to water that changed color with the sky, grey-green on dull days, a cold, furious blue when the wind came in hard from the Atlantic. Gulls screamed overhead with the cheerful cruelty of creatures unbothered by human feeling. The village of Trevannick sat in a shallow fold between two headlands, its whitewashed cottages facing the sea with the resigned steadiness of things that had weathered a great deal and expected to weather more. Eleanor had come here twice before, both times with her father. The Charity House, a small residence that provided shelter and basic provisions to families of drowned fishermen, had been one of his quieter projects, less organized than the schools, more personal. He had known the village rector since boyhood. Eleanor had continued the support after his death, sending funds quarterly and visiting when she could. She had told no one where she was going except Martha and Hatch. She spent the first week in useful occupation. She reviewed the Charity House accounts, helped the current residents with practical matters, walked the cliff paths in the mornings with the wind pulling at her coat and the sea loud below her, and worked very hard at feeling nothing in particular. The coast assisted in this. It was too large and too indifferent to permit self-pity. Standing at the cliff edge, with the Atlantic stretched out to the horizon, the whole of London and its drawing rooms and its whispered conversations felt very small and very far away. On the 8th morning, she heard a horse in the lane below the cottage. She did not need to look out the window. She stood in the center of the small sitting room and waited with her hands folded in front of her and her breathing deliberately even. When the knock came at the door, she opened it herself before Martha could reach it. Sebastian stood on the step. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, not the elegant, composed tiredness of a man who had kept late hours, but something deeper and less managed. His coat was damp at the shoulders. He had ridden, not taken a carriage. His expression carried none of its usual ease. "I would like to explain," he said. "Come in," she said. She did not say she was glad to see him. She was not prepared to examine whether she was. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat across from her and did not remove his coat, as though he understood that this was not a visit that warranted settling in. Outside, the wind moved through the cliff grass with a low, continuous sound. He told her everything. He began at the beginning, the ball, the champagne, Hadley's challenge, the group of them scanning the room with the careless cruelty of men who had never been obliged to consider consequences. He described choosing her. He described the first refusal and how it had surprised him into genuine curiosity. He did not excuse any of it. He did not soften the edges or rearrange the sequence to make himself appear better than he had been. He told it plainly, with the particular discomfort of someone delivering a truth they have no right to expect forgiveness for. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he finished, the only sound in the room was the wind and the distant sea. "How long," she said, "before it stopped being a wager?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yorkshire," he said. The first evening with the accounts. Possibly before that, if I'm honest. And you said nothing? I did not know how to say it, without the saying of it making everything else look worse. It could not look worse than it does, she said. No, he agreed. It couldn't. She looked at him steadily. This was the thing about Sebastian Ashford that had always unsettled her careful defenses. He did not flinch from her directness. Most people deflected or softened when she looked at them without the usual social padding. He simply looked back. I believe you, she said. I believe the feelings are genuine. I believed them before I knew about the wager, and knowing about it does not make them seem false. She paused. It makes them complicated in a way I cannot resolve, simply because you sit here and tell me the truth. I understand that. I was chosen, she said, because I was easy to overlook, because nobody expected it, because I was standing beside a wall at my age, and that made me, what, an interesting problem to solve? Her voice remained level. This was the part that had lived in her chest for 2 weeks like a splinter. I spent years learning not to hope for certain things. I had made my peace with those things. And then you came and... She stopped. He did not fill the silence. He waited. I had genuinely fallen in love with you, she said. That is what makes it unforgivable. Not the wager itself. The fact that you made me feel something I had stopped believing was available to me, and it was built on a game I knew nothing about. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He looked, for once, like a man with no defense to offer and the sense to know it. Will you marry me? He said quietly. No, she said. Please leave. He stood. He paused at the door. I have no right to ask anything further from you, he said. I know that. He left. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded down the lane. The sea moved below the cliffs, vast and entirely unconcerned, and she let it be loud enough to fill the room. She did not cry until Martha had gone to bed. Then she allowed herself 1 hour, no more. Winter arrived early that year and stayed with the stubbornness of an uninvited guest. London frosted over in December and did not thaw properly until February. The Thames ran slow and heavy. Coal smoke hung over the rooftops in a permanent grey drift, and the streets between the grand terraces were cold enough that breath clouded at midday. Society retreated indoors, and the season of earnest letter-writing, fireplace gossip, and careful social manoeuvring began in earnest. Sebastian Ashford did not participate in any of it. He left London 4 days after returning from Cornwall and did not come back for 3 months. He told no one where he was going with any precision. His secretary knew his general direction, his solicitor had a forwarding address for urgent correspondence, and his household staff understood that he required no entertainment arranged and no visitors received in his absence. He went north first. Harnwick. He arrived without announcement and presented himself to Reverend Michaels, who received him with wary surprise and a cup of extremely weak tea. Sebastian asked to see the school's current accounts and the outstanding needs list that Eleanor had compiled during her visit. The Reverend produced both, watching the Duke across the small parlor table with an expression that suggested he was trying to determine what manner of visit this actually was. Sebastian studied the list. The school needed a second room if attendance continued to grow. Miss Pace required a proper annual salary rather than the provisional arrangement currently in place. A lending library of 30 basic volumes would serve both the school and the village families through winter. He arranged all 3 before he left Harnwick. Quietly, through the Reverend and a local solicitor, without attaching his name to any of it in a way that would reach Eleanor's ears directly. The funds were settled as an anonymous endowment through the church. The second room was commissioned from a local builder who was told only that the costs were covered by a private benefactor. He moved on. There were 6 other projects in Eleanor's network that he had learned about gradually over the preceding months, a small piece at a time, the way you learn anything about a person who does not advertise themselves. An orphan relief fund in Durham, a lending library in a market town near Leicester that was losing its lease, a retired schoolteacher in Derbyshire who had been training young women for domestic service and had lost her own income to illness. Sebastian spent January and February moving between them. He did not contact Eleanor. He did not write, did not send word through mutual acquaintances, did not arrange any situation in which she might hear of his movements and feel obliged to respond. He simply worked.
In Durham, he met the fund's administrator, a brisk clergyman named Hartley, who had been managing the whole operation on insufficient means for 2 years, and arranged a proper annual income for the fund through a bank draft that required no continued involvement from Sebastian beyond the initial instruction. In Leicester, he bought the lending library's lease outright and transferred it to the town's reading society at no cost. In Derbyshire, he paid the retired teacher's medical bills and arranged a small annuity that would cover her modest needs without requiring charity applications each quarter. None of it was announced, none of it was performed. He was aware, doing it, that the absence of an audience was the point. Any man could behave well when someone was watching. He had spent most of his adult life behaving well when someone was watching. This was different. And the difference was the only thing that made it worth anything at all. In the evenings, in whatever local inn or modest guest accommodation the week provided, he read. He wrote occasionally in a small journal he had not intended to keep, but found himself filling with observations about the places he passed through, the particular quality of light over Durham's river, the way Derbyshire looked under snow. Small things that he found himself narrating, internally, to an audience of one. He did not allow himself to think too directly about Cornwall. When the memory arrived, and it did, regularly, with the specific cruelty of memories involving things said that cannot be unsaid, he let it pass through without examination, the way you learn to let a cold room be cold rather than fighting it. He returned to London in March, thinner and quieter, and without any of the restless impatience that had characterized most of his adult life. His friends noted the change and attributed it to various things: ill health, financial trouble, a difficult winter. He did not correct them. By April, word had begun filtering back through the quiet channels that connected rural parishes, charitable organizations, and the network of clergymen and administrators who managed such things. Reverend Michaels wrote to a colleague in Leicester. The colleague mentioned the anonymous benefactor's pattern of generosity to a visiting clergyman from Durham. The Durham clergyman wrote to the Derbyshire teacher's former employer. Small threads, moving slowly through a network that had nothing to do with society or drawing rooms or the deliberate circulation of reputation. Eleanor heard it first from Reverend Michaels, who wrote to her in April with a full account of the school's new room, Miss Pace's secured salary, and the library of 30 volumes now installed on the freshly built shelves. He mentioned, carefully, that the funds had come from a private benefactor who had asked for no acknowledgement. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She set it face down on her desk. She picked it up again. She did not write back to Sebastian. She was not ready for that. She sat for a long time at her desk with the letter in her hands, and outside the Surrey countryside was greening quietly into spring. And something inside her that had been held very tightly for several months shifted without permission. Just slightly, just enough. The invitation was Charlotte's idea. Eleanor discovered this 3 weeks after the card had already been sent, when her sister confessed over breakfast with the guilty brightness of someone who considered themselves more helpful than they were being given credit for. Charlotte had written the invitation herself, in her best hand, on the good cream cardstock their mother kept for important correspondence, and dispatched it to Sebastian's London address with the full confidence of a 17-year-old who had decided the situation had gone on long enough. Eleanor set down her teacup with great care. "You had no right to do that," she said. "Someone had to," Charlotte said, spreading butter on her toast with the calm of the entirely unrepentant. "You've been miserable since October, and the house has been miserable with you, and it's Christmas." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it again. She could not uninvite him. That would require writing to him directly, and she had not yet managed that. And she refused to have her first contact with Sebastian in 3 months be a letter rescinding an invitation her 17-year-old sister had issued without permission. The social mechanics of it were too humiliating to contemplate. She said nothing further to Charlotte. She went about her morning with extraordinary composure, and spent a considerable portion of it standing at the sitting-room window, looking at the frost on the garden, and feeling thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone who was not yet old enough to attend a proper ball. He arrived on the 23rd of December.
Whitmore Hall had been dressed for Christmas in the way it always was. Evergreen garlands along the banisters, candles in every window, a kissing bough in the entrance hall that Charlotte had constructed with more enthusiasm than artistry, and which leaned slightly to the left. The house smelled of pine and wood smoke and the warm, spiced fragrance of the puddings Mrs. Hatch had been preparing in the kitchen since the beginning of the month. Snow had fallen 2 days before and settled properly, covering the grounds in the particular deep quiet that snow brings to the countryside. Sebastian came in from the cold, with color in his face from the ride and snow on the shoulders of his greatcoat. He greeted Mrs. Whitmore with genuine warmth, accepted Charlotte's delighted welcome with good humor, and shook hands with the assembled household with the ease of a man who had, somewhere in the preceding months, shed a layer of careful social performance and not replaced it. He looked well, different from the tired, damp figure on the Cornish doorstep, quieter in a way that sat better on him. Eleanor shook his hand in the entrance hall with the correct degree of welcome and excused herself to oversee the tea arrangements, which did not require overseeing, but gave her 10 minutes in the kitchen to collect herself. The first day passed in the comfortable noise of a full house. There were neighboring families for dinner, carol singing around the pianoforte in which Sebastian participated with a decent tenor voice that surprised everyone, including Eleanor, and a long evening of cards and warm punch that kept the drawing room full until late. He did not seek her out privately. He was easy company for everyone, present without demanding attention, and careful in a way she recognized and could not dismiss. He was not performing carefulness. He simply was careful. The way a person is careful when they understand what they have damaged. On Christmas Eve, after the household had gone to bed and the candles were burning low in the sitting room, Eleanor came downstairs for the book she had left on the side table and found Sebastian standing at the window, watching the snow fall in the darkness outside. He turned when she came in. They looked at each other across the quiet room. "I owe you an honest conversation," she said, "and I've been avoiding it because I wasn't certain what I wanted to say." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know that. I am choosing to have it anyway." She sat in the chair by the fire. He sat across from her, and the room was warm and still, and outside the snow continued its silent work on the grounds. She told him what she had never said plainly, that she had spent years constructing a life that did not depend on being chosen, because not being chosen had been the pattern, and she had learned to build something worthwhile inside that pattern, rather than grieve it endlessly. That when he had appeared, she had not wanted to hope, because hope, for someone in her position, was not a light feeling. It was a serious risk. That she had taken the risk anyway, without realizing it, and the wager had made her feel that the risk had confirmed exactly what she had always feared was true. That she was someone people noticed only as an afterthought, a curiosity, a game. "And now," he said quietly when she stopped. "And now," she said, "I have spent 3 months watching you behave like someone I would have chosen, if choosing had ever been available to me." She looked at the fire. "Reverend Michaels is very fond of you." Sebastian said nothing. He waited. "I am not the same woman I was at your ball," she said. "I will not be easy to manage or quiet when I disagree, and I have obligations that will always take up more of my time and attention than society considers appropriate for a wife." "I am not looking for someone easy to manage," he said. "I have had 31 years of everyone being easy to manage, and I find I have very little interest in continuing that way." She looked at him directly. "Ask me again." He moved from his chair and crossed the room and stood before her. And this time, there was nothing calculated in his face, nothing performed, nothing that belonged to ballrooms or wagers or the careful social theater they had both grown up inside. He was simply a man in a firelit room, asking a woman he loved a question he had no certainty of surviving. "Will you marry me, Eleanor?" Outside, the church bells of the village began ringing across the snow-covered fields. First one, then two, then the full warm cascade of Christmas morning arriving in the darkness. She had made him wait through one ball, 2 counties, a harvest festival, a broken trust, and 3 months of silence. "Yes," she said. The bells rang on, indifferent to everything except the cold, clear joy of the hour, and the fire burned steadily, and at Whitmore Hall on Christmas morning, the former spinster of Surrey and the Duke, who had once looked across a ballroom and seen only a wager, looked at each other and found, in the quiet space between them, something neither had expected to deserve. Something real, something worth every difficult mile of the road that had brought them to it.